Welcome, dearly beloved chosen one. Let me tell you something real. The most dangerous thing you can be in a crooked world is clean. Not loud, not powerful, just clean. A clean heart, a clean conscience, a clean soul. Because when you dare to walk in truth while surrounded by lies, your presence becomes a disruption. You don't have to expose anyone. Your purity does it for you. You may not realize it yet, but for 1,825 days, yes, that's 5 long years, you were placed under their microscope. Not because you were guilty, but because they were hoping to prove you weren't as real as you seemed. They weren't curious. They were desperate. Desperate to find something, anything, that would confirm their belief that no one can be that solid. But here's the truth they didn't expect. You didn't just survive their scrutiny. You transcended it. You see, people aren't intimidated by perfection. They're threatened by authenticity. You didn't pretend to be flawless. You just refused to be fake. And that's what broke them. Because your silent strength, your grace under pressure, and your refusal to betray yourself, that was the evidence they couldn't explain. They called you too good to be true, not because you were faking it, but because your very existence forced them to confront their own compromise. And when they couldn't find dirt, they created stories. When they couldn't see weakness, they projected their own. But even then, you stood tall, quiet, observant, untouched. This video is for you, the ones who've been watched, whispered about, doubted, and dissected, but never undone. You're not just clean, you're chosen. And your story isn't about staying pure by accident. It's about mastering the art of staying true in a world designed to corrupt. So don't scroll past this. This is your confirmation. This is your clarity. This is your reminder. They studied you and found God still lives in people. If this word already resonates with your spirit, drop a 111 in the comments and make sure you subscribe, because this is just the beginning. Number 1, under the microscope. They didn't study you because they cared. They didn't keep you under a microscope because they admired you. No, what you experienced was spiritual surveillance born out of discomfort, envy, and the urgent need to justify their own filth. You walked into rooms with quiet confidence, not because you were better, but because you were whole. And that wholeness disrupted everything broken that they had made peace with. For 5 long years, 1,825 days, they watched, they whispered, they waited. Not because you were a threat in the traditional sense, but because your peace was unsettling. Your consistency made their chaos look avoidable. Your strength exposed their excuses. You were never trying to prove anything. You were just being yourself. And that's what made them spiral. Psychologically, humans have a tendency to distrust what appears too good to be true. Not because it is false, but because they've been conditioned to believe goodness can't exist without hidden motives. It threatens the stories they've told themselves, the lies they've leaned on, the compromises they've disguised as survival. You weren't loud about your values. You didn't need a spotlight. You simply lived your truth. And in doing so, you became dangerous in a world addicted to masks. Every time you remained calm when they provoked you. Every time you chose silence over gossip. Every time you forgave when you had every right to retaliate. You made them confront the parts of themselves they'd been avoiding for years. And it drove them mad. You see, the microscope wasn't about finding out who you were. It was about hoping you weren't who you claimed to be. They needed you to trip. They prayed for a flaw. Because if someone like you, real, grounded, authentic, could exist, then what excuse did they have for being fake? You were living proof that light could walk in dark places without turning dim. That you could face betrayal, pressure, isolation, and still choose integrity. And that's not just rare, that's revolutionary. So they created scenarios hoping to see you crack. They tested your patience. They whispered just loud enough for you to hear. They lied, exaggerated, and twisted your words. They tried to bait you into reactions that would discredit your spirit. But what they didn't know is that you were built different. You'd been refined by fire, not flattery. You learned restraint through heartbreak. You developed discernment in silence. You weren't performing for anyone. You were simply aligned with something deeper. And the deeper they looked, the more frustrated they became. Because where they expected to find dirt, they found discipline. Where they expected drama, they found dignity. Where they expected secrets, they found stillness. They thought your calmness meant weakness. They thought your lack of retaliation meant you didn't notice. They mistook your quiet grace for passivity. But it wasn't that you didn't see. It was that you chose not to stoop. You saw the trap and refused to dance in it. You became the walking contradiction to their worldview. You shattered the belief that everyone has a hidden agenda because you didn't. They needed you to be fake. They needed you to be flawed in the way they were. Not just because misery loves company, but because truth terrifies those who've built their identity on lies. And let's be honest, people are comfortable when the darkness is shared. When everyone's gossiping, no one feels guilty. When everyone's bitter, no one has to heal. But then someone like you walks in, someone who doesn't laugh at cruel jokes, someone who doesn't step on others to feel powerful, someone who doesn't flirt with deception just to get ahead. Suddenly, their comfort zone becomes a haunted house. That's why they studied you. Not with admiration, with desperation. They had to find something, because if they didn't, they'd be forced to look in the mirror. And every day they came up empty. Every day they realized you weren't faking it. Every day they saw you respond to chaos with calm, to disrespect with discernment, to pressure with presence. They grew more agitated because you were a standard they couldn't reach. Not because they weren't capable, but because they weren't willing. And that's what separates the chosen from the comfortable. You weren't perfect, but you were whole. You weren't without flaws, but you were true. And that kind of presence is impossible to fake. You didn't walk into rooms trying to shine, but the moment you entered, you exposed what was hiding in the shadows. And when light shows up, darkness has two choices: change or attack. They chose attack, not because you were wrong, but because you were right. And that's what made you dangerous. So here you are, 5 years later, still whole, still grounded, still true. And guess what? They found nothing. Not even a whisper that stuck. Not even a flaw they could weaponize. Because what you carry isn't just integrity. It's divine resilience. It's spiritual maturity. It's the evidence of a soul that's been refined, not corrupted. And in their desperate attempt to expose you, they accidentally exposed themselves. You were never under the microscope. They were, and they failed the test. Number 2, your light exposed their darkness. You didn't have to speak a word. You didn't have to quote scripture. You didn't have to prove anything. All you had to do was show up. And when you did, with your calm spirit, your quiet strength, your peaceful energy, the atmosphere shifted. You didn't know it at first, but your presence wasn't just seen. It was felt. It unnerved people. Not because you were doing anything wrong, but because you weren't doing what they expected. You weren't faking. You weren't posturing. You weren't conforming. And that alone was enough to expose everything they were hiding. See, in a world where most people build their identity around performance, masks, and survival tactics, someone who dares to be authentic is dangerous. Someone who chooses stillness over drama, discernment over reaction, grace over gossip. It interrupts the norm. It makes people uncomfortable. Why? Because your light became a mirror, and mirrors don't lie. When you walked into a room, they started seeing the parts of themselves they buried. They heard their own dishonesty ringing louder. They felt their own bitterness rise to the surface. They remembered the integrity they sacrificed just to fit in, and they hated that feeling. You were a living contradiction to their choices, not because you were perfect, but because you were true, and truth is disruptive. You didn't step on others to elevate yourself. You didn't compromise your character just to be accepted. You didn't bend your standards to blend in. And that, to them, was offensive, because your life silently whispered, "There's another way." They didn't want to hear that. They weren't ready to face that. So instead of self-reflection, they chose resistance. They started avoiding you, but watching you. They smiled at you, but secretly resented you. They imitated your words, but rejected your walk. They couldn't understand how someone could carry peace without pretending, how someone could stand alone without craving validation, how someone could walk with joy without faking a smile. It made them wonder if they had settled, if they had chosen the easy road instead of the right one. And deep down, they knew they had. That's why they wanted to label you fake. Because the alternative was accepting that you were real, and they just weren't ready to rise to your level. Let that sink in. They needed you to be a fraud, because if you were real, then their excuses fell apart. Their compromise, their drama, their masks suddenly looked like what they were. Choices. You didn't need to expose them. You didn't need to correct them. You just kept showing up in your full truth. And that was enough. They whispered about you. They questioned your motives. They said things like, "Nobody's that calm all the time," or "He must be hiding something," or "She's too nice, it's gotta be fake." But the truth is, they weren't describing you. They were revealing themselves. They couldn't imagine someone walking with light, because they'd gotten too used to living in shadows, and so they mocked what they couldn't understand. They called your peace passivity. They called your wisdom weird. They called your discernment distance. But what they really feared was your clarity, because you didn't need their approval to be confident. You didn't need their applause to feel complete. You didn't crave their chaos to feel alive. You had something they didn't, and they felt it, even if they couldn't name it. It was in the way you listened, the way you walked away from drama, the way you stayed soft in a world that begged you to harden. You didn't need revenge, you had release. You didn't need control, you had conviction, and that scared them, because they were taught that power looks loud. But you showed them that real power can be silent, that it doesn't need to shout, it just is. And every time they stood next to you, they felt the gap, not between you and them, but between who they were and who they could have been if they'd made different choices. You didn't know it, but your life was convicting them, and not because you were preaching. You were simply being, and light always makes darkness uncomfortable. That's why they watched you. That's why they talked about you behind your back. That's why they created distance while pretending to be close. They were never really at war with you. They were at war with their own reflection when you walked into the room. They saw your kindness and remembered their cruelty. They saw your patience and remembered their manipulation. They saw your grace and remembered their guilt. And rather than change, they tried to discredit the light. But here's what they didn't expect. Your light couldn't be dimmed. Your joy couldn't be faked. Your soul couldn't be cracked. And the more they tried to find fault, the more they exposed their own wounds. It wasn't your presence that was the problem. It was their inability to stand in the presence of someone who lived the truth they kept running from. So if you've ever wondered why people stared, why they judged, why they kept trying to peel you apart, it's because your spirit made them feel things they weren't ready to deal with. And it wasn't your job to fix them. Your job was to stay true, to stay clean, to stay whole. Because God didn't put you in those rooms to blend in. He put you there to be a mirror, to show people that the light is real, that truth still stands, that peace isn't fake, that goodness still walks among us. And even if they never admit it, you shook something loose in their soul, not by force, but by simply being who you are. Number 3, their obsession was a confession. Here's the part they'll never admit. They weren't just watching you, they were confessing. Every time they analyzed your life, looking for an opening, every time they magnified a moment, hoping to twist your intent, every time they repeated your name in conversations they had no business bringing you into, they weren't exposing you, they were revealing themselves. You weren't under investigation, they were under conviction. Because when people are burdened with guilt they've never faced, they often project it onto the ones who remind them of what they could have been. And you, chosen one, became the screen on which they played out their unresolved shame. They didn't study you out of curiosity. They studied you out of fear. Fear that you were real. Fear that your strength wasn't fake. Fear that your clean soul was actually possible, because if it was, what excuse did they have for letting their integrity rot? Every lie they told about you, every suspicion they broadcasted, every rumor they sprinkled into conversations like poison, it wasn't about you. It was about their need to escape the truth they saw reflected in your life. You reminded them of the standard they abandoned. You reminded them of the choices they never had the courage to make. You reminded them that goodness didn't die. It just became rare. They called your stillness weak. They said your patience was fake. They claimed your peace was just an act. But the truth is, they were confused, because to them, strength always looked like dominance. Power always looked like noise. And peace? Peace didn't look like someone who could carry pain with quiet dignity. But you flipped the script. You didn't lash out when provoked. You didn't retaliate when wronged. You didn't scramble to prove your worth. And that made them panic, because now they had to ask themselves, why couldn't they do the same? Why couldn't they hold it together when life got heavy? Why did they sell out for attention, validation, and false power, while someone like you could stay true in the storm? And instead of answering those questions, they ran from them. They made you the enemy because you made them feel. Not guilt-tripped, not condemned, just exposed. Every accusation they threw your way wasn't rooted in facts. It was rooted in fear. Because if someone could stand that tall without stepping on others, if someone could be that calm without controlling the narrative, if someone could be that real without needing applause, then everything they built was a lie. So they launched a quiet war against your character. They didn't confront you directly. Cowardice rarely does. Instead, they built backdoor stories, subtle shade, half smiles hiding whole resentment. They studied your peace like it was an act. They studied your confidence like it was pride. They studied your discipline like it was control. But deep down, it wasn't suspicion. It was confession. Because it wasn't you they were trying to unmask. It was the mask they were wearing. They just couldn't stand the fact that you didn't wear one. And that's what confused them. Because most people adapt. They shapeshift to survive. They compromise to blend in. But not you. You stayed true. And your consistency became a confrontation they weren't prepared for. They wanted you to fall. Not because they hated you, but because if you stayed upright, it meant they chose to fall. It meant their failure to be real wasn't survival. It was surrender. That's why their obsession wasn't about exposing you. It was about avoiding themselves, because your story forced them to look again. At their own lies, at their own shortcuts, at their own betrayals. And when you didn't crack, when your truth held firm, they cracked inside. Because it was easier to call you fake than to admit they'd faked their entire life. They weren't used to people like you. People who don't need to dominate to feel powerful. People who don't tear others down to feel lifted. People who don't change masks based on the room they walk into. You were constant, and constant people scare chaotic ones. So they projected. They assumed you had to be hiding something, because they always were. They assumed your calm had to be fake, because theirs always was. They assumed your goodness was just a front, because they had never seen someone choose righteousness over recognition. But you weren't performing, you were living. You didn't need validation. You didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room. You just needed to stay aligned. And while they twisted themselves into knots trying to find a flaw, you stood still. And in your stillness, they were forced to confront a simple, terrifying question. What if this person is really who they say they are? What if strength didn't look like manipulation? What if success didn't require dishonor? What if peace wasn't weakness, but wisdom? And if that was true, then what did that make them? That's what broke them. So they obsessed. They overanalyzed. They dissected every move you made, not to understand you, but to escape the pain of knowing they could have been you, but chose not to. And the irony? In their attempts to unmask you, they exposed themselves. You weren't the pretender, you were the proof. The proof that you can walk through fire and not come out smelling like smoke. The proof that integrity still exists. The proof that some people do survive without selling their soul. They weren't your judges. They were your silent confessions. And the moment they realized they couldn't tear you down, they started tearing at themselves. Number 4, the real test was theirs. They thought you were on trial, that every move you made was a test, that every quiet moment was a strategy, that every time you held your tongue, it was because you were hiding something. But here's the truth that flips the whole narrative. The test wasn't yours, it was theirs. They assumed the spotlight was on you, that they were the ones holding the lens. But what they didn't realize was that God was watching them. It was never about whether you'd mess up. It was about how they would respond to someone who didn't. For 1,825 days, they were given a front row seat to something rare. A person who lived what they claimed. A soul that didn't shift to fit the room. A heart that didn't betray itself just to survive. And in that space, God was watching. Not to see if you'd fall, but to see if they'd rise. Would they honor what they saw in you? Would they learn from it? Would they allow the mirror you carried to shift something in their own soul? Or would they reject the opportunity and try to destroy the very thing that could have healed them? That was the test. And they failed. They saw you as a puzzle they needed to solve. But they were the ones being studied. They were the ones on display, not to you, but to heaven. You weren't trying to expose them. You were living in obedience. You were carrying peace, grace, discernment, and they couldn't handle it. Because every time you didn't respond the way they expected, every time you chose stillness over spectacle, every time you blessed when you could have cursed, they saw their own weakness in contrast. And they didn't know how to process that. They thought endurance was passive. They thought kindness was fake. They thought your silence was strategic. But what it really was strength. The kind of strength you don't learn in classrooms. The kind of strength you don't get from applause. The kind of strength that's built in the dark, when no one sees you choosing obedience over ego. And because they couldn't imagine being that strong without a mask, they assumed you had one. That's what made it a test. Would they recognize grace when it walked beside them? Would they acknowledge light without trying to snuff it out? Would they honor truth even when it exposed their lies? That's what they were being measured on. Not your performance, but their response to your presence. And they blew it. Instead of leaning into humility, they leaned into pride. Instead of choosing reflection, they chose projection. Instead of being inspired, they became obsessed. Because it's easier to tear down a person than it is to rise to their level. It's easier to say, they must be faking it, than to admit, I could be doing better. It's easier to criticize strength than to build your own. They thought they were dissecting you, but God was examining them, and they were failing the test in real time. See, every encounter with someone pure is an invitation, not to worship them, not to copy them, but to reflect and realign, to ask, what does this person stir up in me? Conviction? Jealousy? Shame? Inspiration? Whatever rises, that's the lesson. That's the opportunity. But instead of taking the invitation, they took offense. They mocked what they didn't understand. They resisted what they could have learned from. And they turned a divine opportunity into a personal vendetta. That's how you know the test wasn't about you. It was about them. Would they treat a clean soul with honor or suspicion? Would they respect character that didn't need to perform? Would they allow your presence to water something good inside them? Or would they do what the world always does? Try to contaminate what it can't control. God was watching, not to see if you'd react in anger, but to see if they'd respond in truth. And in that moment, they chose bitterness over breakthrough. They chose jealousy over joy. They chose sabotage over surrender. They failed to see that your life was a divine message, a walking example that integrity is possible, that it's still possible to walk through fire and not become smoke. But here's the beautiful thing about it all. You passed, not because you were flawless, but because you stayed faithful. You didn't let their chaos pull you out of character. You didn't let their manipulation redefine your identity. You didn't bend under the pressure to become someone you're not. You remained rooted, grounded, unmoved, and that's all heaven needed to see. Because this wasn't just a season of endurance, it was a prophetic demonstration. God let them study you, so they'd be without excuse. He let them walk closely beside someone clean, so they couldn't say they didn't know better. He allowed them to see light, so when they chose darkness, it was a decision. Now the results are in. You didn't fail. They did. And it's not your burden to carry their guilt. It's not your job to shrink so they feel comfortable. It's not your assignment to prove to people what God already confirmed in you. You weren't on trial. You were a testimony, and your presence was the proof. So walk forward knowing this. Their rejection wasn't personal. It was spiritual. Their gossip wasn't true. It was fear. Their failure to rise wasn't your fault. Because in the end, the test was never about whether you were real. It was about whether they were ready to face it. And now, the separation has begun. Number 5. Integrity as a threat to hypocrisy. Let's be honest about something most people won't say out loud. Integrity is offensive in a world built on pretending. In today's culture, it's not the liar that people fear. It's the honest one. It's the person who doesn't play games. The one who doesn't adjust their truth to fit the crowd. The one who doesn't need applause to keep showing up in full authenticity. That's you, and that's why they couldn't stand you. You didn't even realize it, but your very existence was a threat to the system they depended on to survive. You weren't loud. You weren't dramatic. But you were real. And nothing shakes a room like someone who doesn't need to fake it. You see, people build entire identities on contradiction. They say one thing, do another. They preach values, but fold under pressure. They speak of light, but live in shadows. And here you came, not talking about truth, but living it. And when you live the truth, you expose the lie, not with force, not with judgment, just by being. That's the danger of someone like you. You didn't try to be a savior. You didn't try to be a hero. You weren't walking around with a sign that said, "Look how good I am." You were just being who God made you to be. And that was enough to trigger every hidden thing in the room. Because you weren't a performer. You were the proof. Proof that it's still possible to walk in integrity. Proof that kindness isn't weakness. Proof that you can be soft without being stupid. And powerful without being prideful. And that kind of proof is dangerous to the hypocrite. See, hypocrites rely on illusion. They build unspoken contracts with others. We'll all pretend to be better than we are. We'll all nod along to values we don't live. We'll all play nice, just don't expose the rot underneath. But then someone walks in who doesn't play that game. Someone who tells the truth by being it. Someone who doesn't match the script. Someone who disrupts the rhythm of the room just by standing still. And suddenly the contract is broken. You didn't need to call them out. You were the call-out. You didn't need to accuse them. Your life made the accusation without words. Because when someone walks in purity, every lie gets uncomfortable. Every fake relationship feels strained. Every masked interaction starts to crack under the weight of your authenticity. And that's what they felt around you. Strain. The unspoken stress of having to pretend harder just to maintain the illusion. The pressure of smiling while wondering if you saw through them. The weight of realizing they've made comfort out of compromise, while you've made peace out of purpose. You shook their balance. You challenged their false peace. You didn't play the part. You lived the truth. And in doing so, you broke the one rule of their system. Don't expose what we all agreed to ignore. But you couldn't help it. Not because you were trying to prove a point, but because light doesn't need permission to shine. It just does. And when it does, darkness feels exposed, even if no one's looking directly at it. So what did they do? They said you were fake. They called you too good to be true. They whispered, "Nobody can be that solid." But that wasn't about you. That was them. scrambling to protect their illusion, trying to justify why they stayed small, compromised, and double-minded, while you stayed grounded. You didn't expose them with your words. You exposed them with your consistency, because anyone can be good for a moment. Anyone can say the right thing in public. But to live it every day? To walk it out when no one's watching? To hold your peace when the world pushes your buttons? That's what they couldn't fake. You walked with integrity in places they only talked about, and that shattered their myth. The myth that everyone's got something to hide. The myth that you have to play dirty to survive. The myth that nobody's really real. You shattered it without trying, because they needed the lie to be true. They needed to believe that everyone bends eventually, that everyone has a secret they're hiding, that no one really lives with clean hands and a full heart. But then came you, and they didn't know what to do with you. Because if you were real, then they'd have to stop pretending. They'd have to confront themselves. They'd have to ask why they gave up the light so easily, why they chose survival over sanctity, why they compromised when you showed them it was possible not to. That's why your integrity was never neutral. It was aggressive to them, because it pressed against their comfort zones. It demanded internal confrontation without you saying a word. You didn't challenge their words. You challenged their way of living. And rather than rise to meet it, they tried to bring you down, because that's what people do when they can't match the standard. They destroy it. They'd rather accuse the light of being artificial than admit they've grown used to the dark. But here's what you need to remember. You didn't need them to see it. You didn't need their applause. You didn't even need their understanding. You were never shining for them. You were shining for God, and God saw it all. Every moment you chose truth over image. Every time you swallowed your pride to maintain your peace. Every time you honored your values instead of seeking validation. You weren't just resisting hypocrisy, you were redefining the room. And now that you've exposed the false system with your life, it can't hold the same weight anymore. Because once real is seen, fake, they can't rule the room. Number 6, unbreakable strength. They thought they had you figured out. They looked at your gentleness and called it weakness. They looked at your silence and assumed you were scared. They saw your kindness and mistook it for naivety. But they were wrong. So wrong. Because what they didn't understand was that under that calm exterior was a storm of strength. Not the kind that shows off, not the kind that demands to be seen, but the kind that stands and stays when everything else falls apart. See, in their world, strength is loud. It shouts, it flexes, it forces. But you were a different breed. You didn't have to prove your power. You just embodied it. And that scared them, because they had no blueprint for someone like you. Someone who didn't collapse under pressure. Someone who didn't lash out when provoked. Someone who didn't sell their soul for approval. You kept showing up, steady, grounded, consistent. And in a world full of people who crumble when things get uncomfortable, you stood tall, not because you were trying to look strong, but because you are strong. The kind of strength that doesn't come from ego, but from endurance. You've been through more than they know. You've seen betrayal up close. You've faced silence that could have broken your mind. You've been surrounded by people who wanted you to fail, who planned it, prayed for it, and waited on it. And still, you didn't fold. You didn't play victim. You didn't seek revenge. You didn't run. You stood, and every day you remained unshaken. They lost a little more power over you, because they were counting on your collapse. They needed it to justify their own weakness. They were watching closely, whispering, "Any day now, they'll break." But you didn't. You walked through fire and stayed whole. You carried disappointment and didn't let it make you bitter. You absorbed the pressure and didn't return it as pain. That's not weakness, that's mastery, and they couldn't comprehend it because they didn't know that kind of strength existed. The kind that doesn't need a stage, just a soul. Your refusal to break became their silent frustration because they were hoping you were like them, fragile behind the performance. But you weren't performing. You were anchored. See, some people survive storms because they learn to float, but you built roots, deep roots. You anchored in your faith. You anchored in your values. You anchored in the quiet conversations between you and God that nobody else heard. And when the winds came, you didn't move. That's why they couldn't understand you. Because when the pressure mounted, instead of bending, you straightened your spine. When the gossip swirled, instead of reacting, you grew quieter and more discerning. When betrayal knocked, you opened the door with grace instead of vengeance. They couldn't figure you out, and it drove them mad, because strength like yours isn't common. It's forged in fire. It's born in nights of tears where you still chose trust. It's made in silence where your only cheerleader was heaven. They don't know about the days you wanted to quit, the moments you had to encourage yourself, the weight you carried with a smile so nobody else had to worry. And that's what made you unstoppable, because you didn't draw strength from noise. You drew it from knowing who you are. You didn't need validation to keep walking. You didn't need revenge to feel better. You didn't need anyone's destruction to prove your worth. That's the kind of strength people envy, but never understand. They envied the way you carried pain without turning cold, the way you walked through disappointment and didn't start doubting yourself, the way you continued to love, to give, to build, without letting the bitterness of others make you hard. And secretly, they hated that they couldn't break you. They tried to manipulate. They tried to twist the narrative. They tried to nudge you off center. But no matter how close they got, no matter how subtle the attack, no matter how much pressure they applied, you didn't move. And that's when they realized something powerful. They weren't dealing with a fragile spirit. They were facing a soul forged by God Himself. Your strength didn't come from pride. It came from purpose. You weren't reactive because you were rooted. You weren't defensive because you were delivered. And people who operate from brokenness will never understand the calm of someone who operates from healing. You weren't faking peace, you earned it. And you weren't flaunting strength, you became it. When nobody was clapping, when nobody was helping, when nobody saw the war you were fighting behind the scenes. You are the proof that quiet doesn't mean weak, that gentle doesn't mean unaware, that stillness doesn't mean surrender. And now that they know you can't be moved, they fear you more than they'd ever admit. Because you're not just solid, you're unshakable. You didn't just survive, you rose. You stood your ground, held your dignity, kept your heart soft and your soul clean. And now they have to live with the truth, that while they were trying to figure out how to break you, you were being built in silence, built through storms, built with fireproof faith. And now, you are untouchable. Not because you're perfect, but because nothing they throw at you can stick. Not when God is your shield. Not when purpose is your anchor. Not when the strength inside you was heaven-ordained, not man-made. Number 7, the chapter they can't rewrite. Approx 1,000 words. In the stories they'll tell about their lives, your name won't come up. Not out of disrespect, but out of discomfort. Because you became the chapter that doesn't fit. The piece of the puzzle they can't explain. The truth they can't face. You were the one they tried to ignore, discredit, dismiss. And yet, you're the chapter they'll never forget. Not because you hurt them, but because you healed in front of them. Because you rose when they expected you to fall. Because you stood in integrity while they shrank in compromise. And now, your life stands as evidence. Evidence of what they could have been. Evidence of the decisions they didn't have the courage to make. Evidence of the road they could have taken, but chose not to. They'll try to rewrite the story, to pretend it never happened, to erase the memory of your presence from their conscience. But they can't, because your example is carved into their soul. You were the mirror they avoided, and the measure they couldn't reach. Not because you were perfect, but because you were real, and they knew it. That's what made your presence so unforgettable. You didn't try to be better than them. You weren't loud about your strength. You weren't looking for competition. You were just being you, and that was the problem. Because you, without the mask, without the compromise, without the games, was a living contradiction to everything they had convinced themselves was necessary. They said you had to be cutthroat to get ahead, but you were kind and still elevated. They said you had to manipulate to be respected, but you were honest and still powerful. They said you had to become like the world to survive, but you didn't. You proved them wrong without saying a word, and now they have to carry that. They have to carry the fact that they watched someone live the truth, while they chose the shortcut. They have to live with the reality that your integrity exposed their excuses, that your endurance exposed their weakness, that your consistency revealed just how unstable they truly were. And when the story of their life is told, there will always be that unspoken chapter where they crossed paths with you. And it will sting, because your presence revealed something divine, a moment they were invited to rise, and they chose to stay low. Not because they couldn't do better, but because they didn't want to. They were more comfortable in familiar dysfunction than in unfamiliar growth. They were more committed to looking like they had it all together than actually doing the work to get there. And you did the work. Silently, faithfully, relentlessly. And now your life is the evidence. They'll try to forget. They'll avoid your name in conversation. They'll scroll past your progress in silence. But it won't work, because the imprint has already been made. You didn't leave scars, you left standards. You didn't leave damage, you left conviction. You didn't leave a mess, you left a message. That it's possible to be whole, real, kind, grounded, and successful, all at once. And deep down they know it. They just don't know how to live with it. Because when they think back on the years they knew you, the proximity they had to greatness, they'll have to wrestle with the truth. That they saw you up close and missed the opportunity to change. You were a gift they didn't recognize. A window into who they could have become. A light they tried to dim, only to realize later it was the light they needed. And now it's too late. You've moved on, grown, expanded, healed. You're no longer in the room, but your presence still echoes. Not in your words, not in your actions, but in the void you left behind. Because you can always tell when light has left a space. It gets harder to pretend, harder to fake joy, harder to be okay with the lies you used to tell yourself. And that's what they'll feel. That lingering tension, that sense that something real was once near, and now it's gone. And they'll wonder, what if I had done it differently? What if I had owned my truth instead of fighting theirs? What if I had honored the example instead of trying to tear it down? But that chapter's already been written, and your role in it is finished. You're not here to dwell on what they missed. You're not here to fix the part of the story they chose to sabotage. You're not here to validate people who walked away from the very light they needed to follow. You're here to live the rest of your story, fully, and whether they ever acknowledge it or not, your chapter remains in the silence, in the regret, in the parts of their story they skip over because it hits too close to home. But it's still there, because truth doesn't need permission to leave its mark. It just does. And you, chosen one, you were the chapter they couldn't rewrite, the page they couldn't skip, the presence they couldn't shake. And long after the roles have shifted, long after the connections have faded, long after the dust has settled, you'll still be the moment that made them pause. Because you didn't just pass through their life, you exposed what was broken, and you proved what was possible. So now you see it clearly. You weren't the problem. You weren't the trial. You weren't the one who needed fixing. You were the example. You were the invitation. You were the reflection they weren't ready to see. For 1,825 days, they watched you hoping to catch a flaw. But what they really caught was a glimpse of everything they could have been. And that's what broke them. Your clean soul wasn't a performance. It was a product of pain, discipline, faith, and the kind of quiet strength most people will never understand. And now, you're rising. Not because they approved you, not because they celebrated you, but because heaven saw you, and God's approval outweighs the noise of every critic. You passed the test. You kept your heart intact. You held your peace. You walked through fire and came out refined, not ruined. And while they tried to rewrite your story, they forgot that God holds the pen. Let this message be a confirmation for your soul. You're not just chosen. You're anointed. You carry a rare kind of power that doesn't come from noise. It comes from knowing. Knowing who you are. Knowing whose you are. Knowing what you carry. So from here on, stop shrinking. Stop over-explaining. Stop doubting the divine evidence of your life. You don't need to defend what God has already confirmed. You don't need to argue with people who saw the light and still chose darkness. You don't need to prove what time and truth will reveal on their own. Let them wrestle with your silence. Let them sit with their regret. Let them replay the chapters where your grace made them feel small. Not because you tried to make them feel that way, but because they weren't ready to grow. And you? You keep walking. You keep rising. You keep living in truth, no matter who doesn't understand it. Because your integrity already preached the message. Your peace already gave the sermon. Your survival already told the story. And the story ends like this. They watched you for years and found a clean soul. Not a mask, not a scandal, not a contradiction, just someone who refused to be reshaped by the dirt they threw. So walk tall, walk free, walk in power, because the world didn't give you your strength, and the world can't take it away. If this message touched your soul, I want you to drop 777 in the comments as your prophetic agreement that your season of silent endurance has now become your season of visible elevation. And if you haven't already, make sure you like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share this word with someone who's been walking through their own fire, quietly, faithfully, and powerfully. Because this was for you. The world may never understand you, but heaven has already affirmed you, and that's all you'll ever need.